Our presenter tonight is well known to all of you, as well as to most of the music listeners of America. I am going to do the full introduction for the full talk, but I'd like to say that Jim always manages to bring a really surprising and exciting aspect to things, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the story of Sergei Korolev from his standpoint. So, to get that started, Jim Shedlowsky.
Yo!
See if I can get the computer to cooperate here. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
The space race. That period of the time from the launching of Sputnik, the world's first Earth satellite, to Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong's harrowing landing on the moon. It was an exciting period of time for those of us old enough to remember it firsthand, a few of us in the room, and a memorable era in world history, which produced a quantum leap acceleration in mankind's technical prowess, leading to such things as the internet, personal computing, medical technology, GPS and the like, and yes, the mastery of rocket science. But how many of you know how all this came about? What were the circumstances that brought about the space race? How did it happen, and why, and who was responsible? Well, many individuals were involved. Some might say John F. Kennedy or Wernher von Braun or whoever. Tonight, I hope to convince you that one man, more than any single person or group of people, was largely responsible for starting and then steering the space race. This man, who did not live to see Armstrong's moon landing of the Eagle, and whose very identity was a secret while he was alive, was a Ukrainian named Korolev. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the chief designer, a monumental figure in the history of space exploration, but unknown to the Western world until his tragic death in 1966, after which he was a worldwide celebrity, as indicated by these special issue stamps from around the world. He was the mastermind behind the Soviet space effort from its beginning, and personally responsible for many of the groundbreaking first achievements in space travel, such as the first satellite, Sputnik, the first animal in space, Laika the dog, the first photos of the back side of the moon, the first man in the moon, or the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, the first spacewalk, the first spacecraft to impact on the moon or another planet, and the first to orbit and soft land on the moon. As we shall see, he not only conceived and executed these and other milestones, but he created the massive infrastructure and intricate technological development system which made them possible. This, in a country recovering from the terrible devastation of World War II. This presentation shall cover who this man was and how he was able to achieve such amazing accomplishments. But since most of you, I think everybody in the room, is much younger than I am, let me take you back to the time when all this started. The year was 1956, before many of you were born. 11 years after the end of World War II, and Dwight Eisenhower was president. Times were good. Ike had just signed a bill authorizing the construction of the interstate highway system, the largest public works project in history, at $25 billion for the construction of the 41,000 miles of highways that we now enjoy. The economy was booming with new homes and new cars at record levels. Rock and roll was brand new and sweeping the world, with that youngster Elvis Presley releasing his first gold record, Heartbreak Hotel, and appearing on Ed Sullivan's show, the #1 TV show at that time. Computers were around, but they were still a bit primitive, as is shown by this 5-megabyte hard drive being loaded on a transport plane.
That's a person standing behind that hard drive.
And in 1956, I was a 19-year-old sophomore at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, struggling with physical chemistry. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, times were not so good. After the devastation of World War II, with a loss of over 25 million lives, their ruthless and paranoid dictator, Joseph Stalin, had placed the USSR and its satellites behind an iron curtain, isolating it economically and ideologically, and seeking to extend communist influence and dominion around the world. Stalin's post-war rebuilding emphasized military and heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods and agriculture. To justify this, he instilled the threat of American aggression into the Russian psyche and sought to achieve military parity with the United States. When Stalin died in March of 1953, his ultimate successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was left with a nation in dire need of homes, food, and other basic necessities, while still outgunned militarily by the U.S. In his efforts to consolidate his leadership, Khrushchev attempted reforms to correct the consumer shortfalls in food, housing, and other commodities, while maintaining a strong military. His efforts to end the reign of terror under which Stalin had led the country for 2 decades culminated in his famous but secret speech in Moscow to the 20th Party Congress on February 25th of 1956, in which he denounced the extreme repressions of the Stalin era, of which he and other Politburo members had been participants. This unsettling speech to his fellow party members was uncomfortably fresh in the mind as his party Congress ended, with concerns about how this new ideology would affect the Soviet Empire and its masses. So this was a situation, the political situation. Several days later, on February 27, 1956, just a few days after that big meeting and speech of Khrushchev, when Khrushchev and his 3 fellow Politburo or Presidium members were chauffeur-driven in their ZIS-110s from the Kremlin, some 50 miles northeast to Podliki, which had recently been renamed Kaliningrad, to the secret Russian Missile Development Center complex named NII-88, to be educated and updated as to the state of the Soviet missile development program, of which they had been unaware while Stalin was still in charge. Stalin had secretly initiated a concerted missile development program after World War II in hopes of countering the overwhelming American superiority in strategic air power. Stalin's other secret high-priority military program, the development of nuclear weaponry, had recently borne fruit in August of 1953, and the marriage of these 2 crucial military technologies was now underway and of supreme importance to the new rulers of the Soviet Union for several important reasons. First of all, the Kremlin leadership was unsettled by the U.S.'s aggressive and hardline anti-communism policy as expressed by John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and his doctrine of, quote, massive retaliation with the promise of, quote, an instant, tremendous, and devastating nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, if necessary, to create sufficient fear to deter aggression. This threat was backed up by General Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command, which had just been formed, with overwhelming capabilities to destroy the Soviet Union. Most distressing to Khrushchev was his complete inability to strike back. The prospect of a thermonuclear weapon delivered by a ballistic missile system, which was indefensible, offered a credible response to Dulles and those war-hawk Americans, and it would be cost-effective, enabling the diversion of significant funding for Khrushchev's consumerism programs. Khrushchev and his Politburo comrades were ushered into one of the largest buildings on the complex, a surprisingly clean and modern hangar of imposing size. They were met by a short, powerfully built man, Sergei Korolev, who pointed out to the first of 3 rockets lying on holding rings and said, "This is our past." He was referring to the R-1, the first Soviet ballistic missile, a copy of the German World War II V-2 rocket with minor modifications. This tactical missile had become operational in late 1950 and was the basis for the Soviet missile industry. The second rocket, explained Korolev, was the R-2, a stretched version of the R-1 V-2 design with a number of significant modifications, which had become operational in June of 1953 and was now deployed around the perimeter of the Warsaw Pact countries with its gruesome radiological warhead. The final missile on display prompted Korolev to announce, "This brings us to the present. This is the R-5, the first Soviet strategic rocket, built entirely by Russians without German help. And this is an operational missile which had delivered an 80-kiloton nuclear warhead over 750 miles just 3 weeks previously. The world's first nuclear ballistic missile ever." After a moment of stunned silence, Khrushchev asked, hang on here, what did he ask?
Want to go to lunch?
"What countries are in its range?" Whereby Korolev walked over to a map of Europe which indicated that the R-5 could strike every nation in Europe except for Spain and Portugal. Khrushchev then asked, "How many warheads would be needed to destroy England?" The answer was 5. Khrushchev, who was aware that London had survived more than 1,000 V-2s from the Nazis, said, "Only 5? Terrible, astonishing, and cost-effective too." He asked Korolev if he could extend the R-5's range. The chief designer said flatly, "No, a new missile would be required." Now Korolev knew that he had their attention, and this was the moment he had been waiting for more than a decade. "We have seen the past and the present of Soviet rocketry," and walking toward a large double door declared, "This is the future," at which the doors opened wide into a top-secret inner room whose walls soared upwards rather than lengthwise like the hangar they had been in. "The R-7, announced Korolev. Khrushchev and his comrades stood in awe of the gigantic full-size model of a rocket standing in the middle of the huge room. Korolev then explained that it could deliver a 5-ton thermonuclear warhead over 5,000 miles at 24,000 miles an hour. The R-7 could reach the United States in less than half an hour, changing the entire security dynamic of the Cold War. He was asked, when would this fantastic new weapon be ready? Korolev answered, we will begin testing later this year and should be successful in little more than a year, with the proper backing. Khrushchev's memoirs quote him highlighting how amazed he was by Korolev's work. Quote, I don't want to exaggerate, but I'd say we got at what he showed us as if we were a bunch of sheep seeing a new gate for the first time, end of quotes. Korolev, in short, had convinced Khrushchev and his Politburo members to gamble that the Americans had bet their money on the wrong weapons system. Khrushchev was ready to bet the farm on Korolev. Korolev was now in a confident enough position to seek support for a pet project that he had been promoting for several years and dreaming of for decades. As the group was about to leave, he said, "I would now like to show you still another project." According to Sergei Korolev, who was there as a guest of his father, Korolev, quote, "led us to a modest place in the corner, to a model of some kind of unusual apparatus, a flying machine, but this one had rods protruding on all sides and paneling swollen by projections. What is it?" asked the group. "A satellite, an Earth satellite," replied Korolev. Sensing a lack of interest, he launched into an impassioned speech about how mankind had long dreamed of escaping the bonds of Earth. How the 19th century Russian visionary, Shedlowsky, had been the first to describe the means. How such a device could be the ideal spy machine or perhaps weapons platform. And how the Americans were actively working on such a project. Did that ex-Nazi Wernher von Braun. He stressed the scientific prestige that would come to the Soviet Union if they could beat the Americans. He also stressed that while the Americans were spending millions on this, that the R-7 would be capable of launching this satellite with minor modifications and at a low cost. Minutes passed and Korolev once more assured his Kremlin masters that launching a satellite would in no way interfere with the development of the ICBM, since it could only occur once the R-7 was fully operational anyway. Khrushchev seemed to weigh this and finally said, "Okay, if the main task does not suffer, you can do it." Korolev now had his mandate, and even though the rest of the world did not know it yet, the space race had begun. And I'll finish this up with the rest of the program.
Bravo. Bravo.
I wonder how it's going to turn out. Okay, it's time for everyone's favorite, the snack break.